everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Erin Aoyama, and I am delighted to be welcoming you to this really wonderful session, which is called Writing Fiction from Intergenerational Trauma. So we're going to hear today from three authors of novels who've written about their sort of family stories or Nikkei intergenerational trauma to share a little bit about the process and some of the challenges of writing fiction from family history. So I'm going to introduce our three authors and then start us off with a question, and then they will take away the conversation. Please leave any questions that you have for our guests in the chat, and we will leave time to get to those at the end of the session. So to start us off, I want to welcome Kimiko Guthrie, who is the co-founder of Dandelion Dance Theater and a lecturer at Cal State East Bay. Kimiko holds a BA in creative writing from UC Santa Cruz and an MFA in choreography from Mills College. And her debut novel, Block 17, was inspired by her experience growing up with a mother who was imprisoned as a child in a Japanese American incarceration camp. Block 17 received praise from Salon, Booklist, Ms. Magazine, and more, and was an editor's pick at Audible. Hi, Kimiko. Nice to have you.
Hello, Erin. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Next, I want to welcome Emily Inoue-Huey. Emily writes historical fiction for children and teens. Her first novel, Beneath the Wide Silk Sky, won the Malka Penn Award for Human Rights in Children's Literature and the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators Golden Kite Award. During World War II, Emily's family was removed from their homes and farms in California and Washington State, and her grandparents, Charles and Bessie, met and married in Heart Mountain Camp in Wyoming. Her father was born in the camp hospital, and when the war ended, the family was sent to Utah, where they started over and where Emily still lives, now with her husband Robert and their 4 children. Emily holds an MFA in creative writing from Lesley University and is a former teacher. Besides books, her passions include education, the arts, the outdoors, and her family. Hi, Emily. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, I'm so excited to welcome Alden Hayashi. Alden is a Sansei who was born and raised in Honolulu, but now lives in Boston. After writing about science, technology, and business for more than 30 years, Alden has recently begun writing fiction and essays to preserve stories of the Nikkei experience. His first novel, Two Nails, One Love, was published by Black Rose Writing in 2021, and his short stories have appeared in the Baltimore Review, the Gordon Square Review, and the Bamboo Ridge Journal. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm so looking forward to this conversation and to hearing each of you talk a little bit about your process and your writing. I'm going to kick us off with a question, and then I'll step to the backstage and come back at the end. But for all three of you, just to get started, could you tell us a little bit about what inspired your story? Maybe Kimiko, I'll pass it to you first.
All right. Thanks, Erin. So I guess, just I've always known that I've wanted to write something about camp. But whenever I wrote short stories, but whenever I went to write something longer, I never quite knew how to approach it, sort of what angle to enter from. And I think I was mentioning to Alden the other day, I have this really clear memory of lying in bed and saying to my husband, I really want to write about camp, but I just feel this block, like this big wall. And he said, well, write about the wall, and that made a lot of sense to me. So growing up, I heard lots of fragments about camp from my mom, remembering and talking with her siblings. But it was confusing because the memories were often very cheerful, like stories of their parents by the river relaxing, my jichan fishing, and my bachan singing. And then the more I grew up and sort of heard the facts about camp and learned the harsh truth of camp, the cheerful stories and the facts made this sort of strange cacophony in my mind. And, my mom actually is quite unusual. She's 87. She lives right downstairs. She's about to be 87, and she's still a trauma therapist. So she was actually pretty radical for her time, in that she did speak about some of the darker aspects of camp. But still, there was this tendency to look at only the kind of cheerful side. And I talked to a lot of my contemporaries. I'm Sansei. And it was I found that I was not unique in that most of the people I talked to said that their families really suppressed the painful memories, the trauma. And so I wanted my book to come from a place of exploring how buried trauma affects us. And not just sort of from I grew up, hearing a lot that the reason we don't talk about camp, or the reason, Japanese families don't talk about camp, is because of sort of a Japanese cultural phenomenon of repressing things. And while that, I think there is some truth there, the more I sort of looked at the history, the more I really saw how, it was really, we were forcibly silenced, just the FBI sweeping through neighborhoods before camp and arresting all community leaders and anyone who spoke out, other means of intimidation and imprisoning of families. All of these were sort of the government's ways of systematically silencing the community. So I wanted to not only look at that sort of internalized repression, but those external forces. And just lastly, I chose to set it in the current day because I really wanted to approach the story from my own perspective, and also to show how it's not just history. So many of the forces working then are still, unfortunately, happening now, with demonization of immigrants and other groups, and how civil liberties are often stripped in the name of national security to this day. So kind of wanted to show those connections. How about, see, Alden, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Kimi. And yeah, I think our stories are very similar in a lot of respects. And I think being a Sansei, I think we're not, exceptions to the rule. We're just sort of more like other Sanseis. I don't know if you know Brian Niiya at Densho out in Seattle. He's works as a historian there for that website, and I like the way he describes it. He says for a lot of us Sanseis, it's sort of a rite of passage when we finally learn what camp was all about. And I was very much like that, in that my mother only, and I think my mother was less open about it, much less than your mother was. My mother referred to it as camp, and my earliest, I think, image of it was like summer camp or band camp, or I just had a totally wrong image of it. And it wasn't until high school that I learned through my social studies teacher that no, these were, I don't think she used the word concentration camp then, but yeah, they were relocation camps, and that people were forcibly relocated there. And then over the years, more and more came out. And Kimi, I think I love the way you described it at another book talk, how these shards of memory would kind of come at you at different times in your life, and you're not even quite sure, what. To me, they were sort of like puzzle pieces, and you're not even sure, okay, what is the big puzzle all about? You're getting these pieces, and you're not even sure which fit where, and but over the years, if you start paying more and more attention to your uncles and aunts, as well as your parents, you start to put it together. But even now, I don't even know, how much of the puzzle I have together. And for me, the defining moment was definitely when my parents came out to the East Coast, and we went to the Statue of Liberty, and we caught the ferry there. My mother had a emotional breakdown seeing it, and it was unnerving to see her like that in public. And later I learned why. It was that she had actually seen the Statue of Liberty before. I never knew this. But when during the war, when her family was transported from the Jerome camp, uh, and they were going to be part of this hostage exchange in 1943, hostage exchange between the U.S. and Japan. And so essentially she was deported and had to leave from New York Harbor on a boat. And so she had seen the Statue of Liberty at that point 40 years ago. So anyway, yeah, I realized then this was a very traumatic experience that my mother had suppressed, and only, as an adult, and I think I was in my 40s, and yeah, I started to get a better grasp of it. And I'm really interested to hear Emily, you talk, because you're a generation removed, I
Yeah.
think,
I'm
from
a Yonsei, yeah.
yeah. So I'm very interested to hear like your perspective and when you learned
Thank you.
about the trauma, what happened to your family during World War II.
Yeah, I think I was 8 years old when I first
Oh.
heard about it. My grandparents were having their 50th anniversary, and it was like what you said, both of you, about your, they kind of, they called it camp, and they talked about how my grandma and grandpa had met there, and my grandma told these stories that were funny stories about how for all they could do for dates was walk around the barbed wire, and she would just laugh, and she always slapped her knee as she laughed and would say, "Oh, he was such a fast walker," or she'd tell the story of how they had to get married in a little tiny barrack, and so there was no room, and the reverend had just eaten garlic, so she'd tell the funny stories. But then, as an 8-year-old, I remember sitting there and thinking, why was my grandma, this lady who always has pop for me in her fridge, and it's just the nice, why would she ever be in a prison? And I didn't understand it, and it was years, probably over a decade, before I ever asked them about it more in depth.
Yeah.
And then when I was in college, I asked them to do interviews, and at first they said no, as I think this is kind of a common experience in our community. But I had all these questions. I live in Utah. The city I lived in was called Provo. In 2019, it was voted the most heterogeneous city in Utah, in America. So I mean, it's still pretty, homogenous. I'm sorry, I said heterogeneous. I meant homogenous.
Oh,
yeah. I, didn't look like other people. I was very aware that something had happened in our family story that had changed everything. And so that's part of why I started doing the research. And I did the research before I ever had any thoughts of writing a book. But I had all these questions about why my grandparents were the way they were, and why my dad was the way he was even. He was born in camp, but didn't remember it very well. But he would still, when I was 14 years old and I was going out with my friends, he said, all these people you think are your friends, they can turn on you. And I was like, Dad, that's a horrible thing to say. And he's like, oh, that's what my dad used to say to me, and that it kind of weaves its way into our family story. And so that was one thing I wanted to understand. The other thing was that when I did start asking people about it and talking about it, whenever I talked to anyone, they were like, this is awful. This should never have happened. I can't believe it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when I do the research, I found these polls from the time that said 93% of Americans thought this was a good idea, and that juxtaposition has haunted me. That idea of something we all know is just awful and should never happen, being completely acceptable to a society. Like, how do we get to that point? And if we can get to that point because of hysteria and fear, could that happen?
Mm-hmm.
Could I ever agree to something like that? Could the people around me agree to something like that? And so that's kind of where I came from when I wanted to write this book, was to deal with those questions. And my book is a little bit different in that it's not set after camp. It's actually set before camp.
Mm-hmm.
I always knew that I was writing a story that mostly took place before they were incarcerated, and so that was really, for me, that question of how do we get to a point like this was the thing I wanted to explore. So I feel like we're always kind of in that point before we do something terrible.
Yeah.
And we've got to stop before we get there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Emily, that's one thing I really wanted to ask you today. And I found it interesting that for Kimi and me, our novels take place in present time. And what happened in World War II is the past. And it's told kind of through a filter or, for my novel anyway, it's the mother telling the son, who the son is then relaying that information. But your novel your novel, of course, it's about the past, but it's the past is the present in your novel. And so you wrote it so well, and it's like this, you are there at that time period when the trauma is occurring. And I just found it interesting that for Kimi and me, that we, maybe as sanseis, we learned it about this later in our lives, and the way we learned it was more through this filter, and that's the way we wrote about it initially. I would have loved to have written a book like your book. In fact, I had planned to do it, but I just found it too difficult. And I wonder, because of the generational difference between us, did it make it easier for you? And actually, I'm wondering about you, Kimi, if you ever thought of doing a book where the past was more present.
Well, I do think there is something to that idea of being far enough away from it that you can do it. I do think there are people who've been even closer to it, people who've actually experienced it and have written about it. And of course, I have family members who write as well. And some in that generation before me have written about it.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine my dad writing this book in a certain way. I think there is privilege in being a few generations away from it in terms of having the ability to speak about it and process it. And part of that is because of just cultural differences between the generations, but also, I think I grew up with those terrible sacrifices being in the past, not in my personal life. And I will never be able to express my love and gratitude to those people enough, for the things they went through that have made the life I have possible. So, I do think there is something to that for sure. I would also say that, writing a book like the books you guys have written, to me seems even harder. So I really think it's wonderful that you guys have been able to write about this moment, and how I think that's what we need to understand. These, we Yonsei who are coming up, we need to understand how these things affect us all even today, Yeah.
And for me, I guess, in response to your question, Alden, well, I'm not a historian, even though I love doing research. And actually for my new novel, it is set in the past as present, but it's kind of jumps around. But yeah, I was much more because I really felt that I would leave the history books to the historians and there's so many people writing such great sort of factual accounts of camp and continuing to do so. But I was really interested in, kind of as I was mentioning, writing about that wall was my content, writing about the trauma. And, my mom is a trauma therapist, so I hear a lot about her talking about it. But, the nature of trauma is that it fractures our sense of who we are, sort of our cohesive experience is shattered, and we sort of get stuck in a loop, almost like a time loop of repetition, of reliving the past. And so I really wanted my story to kind of almost like simulate that experience for the reader of disorientation, nonlinear, more of a surreal experience that I think is in a way closer to poetry in a way than sort of a logical historical narrative. So yeah, I was really interested in exploring that experience of trauma more than historically depicting the past.
Yeah. Kimi, that's one thing I wanted to ask you about your book, and that I love the way you wrote it, where it takes place in the present, but the past comes in these interspersed chapters. And I felt like you were saying earlier, like these were these shards of memory that kind of impinge on you in the present. And it's not a linear thing, and it just comes at you and might come at you at different times in your life. I actually started writing my novel that way, and it was too hard for me. So, what I did was I put all the past stuff in the middle of my novel. I just found it easier to write that way. So I wanted to say, you did a great job in doing that. I wish I could have done it because, it's just tougher, to interweave it the way you did. And I thought you did a brilliant job doing that.
Oh, well, thank you. I love your structure as well. I thought that worked really well to have the mom sort of us plunge into the mom's experience, when we did. And I love how you framed it. I just still, thinking about how the book opens at the airport and then at the end of the airport, and just the frame of him in the present waiting for his mom to come. It was just such a powerful moment that you captured. But yeah, I think the structure that you used was really powerful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Well, this kind of leads me into a question that I think we're kind of touching on, but just sort of thinking about why we chose fiction as opposed to nonfiction. If either of you wanted to touch on that a little bit more. Maybe Alden, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
Or had you thought of writing nonfiction at
Oh,
all?
yeah. Kimi, this book that I had been working on for so long, it started off being nonfiction. I wanted to do it as nonfiction. Actually, my dream would have been to sit my mother down and have her tell me her story and do either biography or memoir. And I could have ghostwritten it for her. That would have been my dream project. But yeah, she was not willing at all to do that. But I wanted to do it as nonfiction. And that's my background. For 30 something years, I've been a nonfiction writer. But as I started to write this, I just had too many gaps in my knowledge of what exactly happened to my mother's family. I know the major things. I know they were deported. I know about the hostage exchange. But, according to the U.S. Government records, my grandfather, my mother's father, agreed to be part of this hostage exchange. But I don't have any records of his interrogations while he was at the Santa Fe prison. So I don't know how much coercion was involved. I don't know what. I know the family was separated, and I know it was that they wanted to be reunited, and I know, they were told, well, if you were to agree to go to Japan, you'll be reunited. So all that, and there's just a lot of that I didn't know for sure. So I would have felt dishonest doing that as a purely nonfiction book. So I felt I kind of got painted into a corner where the only way to tell her story, and I felt I had to tell her story because this hostage exchange did happen, and I think it was just a horrible thing that the US government did on top of the concentration camps.
I actually hadn't ever heard about it until you talked about it at Rower during the Pilgrimage Book Talk.
Yeah.
I have done so much research about, the incarceration. And so, yeah, I was really interested to hear about that.
Yeah. So, in the author's note to my novel, I do make it clear that this actually happened. And I cite some references that people can refer to. But yeah, so for me, I didn't want to write fiction, but it was the only way to tell the story where certain gaps I could fill in using my imagination. So I think, Emily, I know you studied creative writing, so I think you have more of a love for fiction.
Well, I think going back to what you said earlier, I'm a little removed from it, and by the time I started writing, my grandparents were gone. My father had actually died, and so for me, there wasn't someone to. Well, there are some aunts I wish would write their biographies. I think their stories are wonderful, but I did. Fiction was kind of the best option. But beyond that, I think I come to this as a teacher, and I had seen how when I'd present facts to my students, it just kind of goes through them. But when you tell them the story of one person, and it can be a true story, like a biography, but one person, that gets in deep, and And so, you know, when you hear 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated, you know, it's awful, it's horrific, but you can kind of hold it at a distance. Whereas when you read the story of one person, and I tried to make it as true as possible, you know, every single thing I had happened to her in the book is something I found in an interview, or someone's firsthand account. And so,
Yeah.
but still, you know, that it's a person that you're in their head, they're kind of your avatar through the experience. It has that impact, and I wanted that, and I actually remembered reading a book, not one of the famous ones, about the incarceration right now, that when I was a child, and I remembered it had sort of started with the story of a girl, and then it had dropped her story and said what happened to all Japanese Americans. And I remember disliking that moment when they stopped telling her story. And so this is something that I had wanted clear back then and decided to do now. But yeah. What about you, Kimiko?
Yeah, well, kind of like I was saying, I felt that because I was really writing about that inherited trauma, and the nature of that trauma is so fractured and sort of surreal, I felt that something closer to poetry, which I see fiction as, you know, sort of a kind of poetry in a way, was the most appropriate way to approach that subject. And also my main character, we've talked about this a little bit, Alden, is really an unreliable narrator in many ways, because she doesn't have access to all that information, like a lot of us are saying. So that couldn't be, you don't have many history books with unreliable narrators. So yeah, and I have this little experience that I had recently in terms of kind of thinking about being historically accurate or not, that I maybe I'll share just really briefly. You know, I had the really amazing opportunity of going on a pilgrimage with Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages last May with my mom and my two daughters. So there were 3 generations of us going to Rower, which was really powerful to see this site that I've heard so much about, that has kind of been such a part of my conscious and unconscious. And I really wanted to go. In part, I felt like it was this duty that I had to go to be more historically accurate. Like I wanted to see the site. I felt kind of like a fake writing about it when I hadn't been there. But the reason I hadn't gone, it just was so loaded to me. So many ghosts there, you know, and my mom didn't know if she wanted to go. But finally I said, Mom, I have to go. You know, I want to see the river. I want to write about more accurately about the river. And I was really fixated on the river. The river has always sort of run through my family's stories of camp as this healing place. They would go there as a refuge from all the terror of camp, you know, this powerful force of nature that was apart from all the idiocy, you know, of their incarceration. So I remember talking to Kimiko Mar, you know, who's organizing it, saying, Kimiko, will we get to see the river? And she's been there so many times. And she said, I don't remember ever seeing a river. And I was like, what? I was really confused. So we finally got to the site, and we get there and there's no river. And I'm looking around, and I'm looking at the map, and I'm asking all these people. And then finally someone said, oh, you know, the swamp that was here was drained long ago, and the tributary that your mom remembers, you know, is gone. And at first I was like, oh no, now I can never write accurately about it. And then it just sort of occurred to me, it sounds so obvious, but it felt very profound, that now the river only exists in the past and in memory and in a way within myself. And I felt this like powerful presence of the river within myself. And yeah, just sort of gave me permission that I don't always I can't really accurately depict anything. I really can only access my own inherited memories. So.
Kimi, I have to say, I'm surprised because you wrote Block 17 before you even went on the
I know, and I felt guilty about that.
Oh my God, but the scene that you've written in there, you know, that takes place at the river, it's like, it's harrowing. And I felt like you must have been there, or, you know, it's just, I guess, this speaks to the power of fiction, that, you know, that you've imagined something that is so real, and that, you know, and funny, ironically, I guess now that it doesn't even exist now anyway.
Well, that's, yeah.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend and author who I really admire, who writes a lot about the incarceration. I think I was mentioning his new book to you, Alden, Brandon Shimoda, and I mentioned this story to him, and he said something that really struck me. He was like, "Wow, well now in a way the river is protected, because it's only within you, and it's sort of evaporated and transmigrated into memory." He said something like that, and I found that really profound. That now I can visit that river whenever. Not that, I mean, there was something profound also about being on the ground there in Rower. So I'm really glad that I went for so many reasons. But yeah, that river just feels very surreal to me.
You reminded me. So one of my favorite novelists is Amy Tan,
Yeah.
The Joy Luck Club and all. And she has a great quote, and I have to paraphrase it, but she said, "When I write fiction, people say, 'Oh, you're just making things up, Amy,' and you just." She said, "No, fiction has the power of truth.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways that nonfiction, even though it can be very factual, doesn't." And I think, for you, Emily, certainly, I think your book has that, and Kimi, you too, and something I attempted, in my book, to
Oh,
be
definitely.
very truthful, even though it was fiction. So yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question for Alden. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, maybe out of order, but if you don't mind, I just love how your book explores so powerfully the intergenerational trauma and a part of history that I was mentioning that I didn't know about, even though I've been studying about the incarceration for so long. But your book also deals with the theme of, sexual identity and coming out and homophobia. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you took these themes that might be parallel in certain ways, but found the intersections. For Ethan, felt like a very integrated character. And I never felt like, oh, we're over here with this one theme, or oh, we're over here with another theme. It felt very, unified. And I really admire that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, like, did you always know that his sort of sexual identity and that journey was going to be part of this novel, or how did you find those intersections?
It was, I think, during the process of writing the manuscript that I figured out what the story was really about, about intergenerational trauma, and that about two people, the two nails of the title, mother and son, that being very similar but not realizing it, until much later. That's their learning process. But I thought, as Emily and Kimi, as you talk about, you wanting your fiction to resonate a little more. This is, I think it was you, Emily, who said, this is not just a Japanese American story. That you want people to understand that what happened, you don't want it to happen again. If it's, whether it's anti-Muslim sentiment now or whatever, and that's the power of fiction, I think, that it can resonate beyond. So for me, what I tried to get to resonate was that, okay, so the mother, faced horrible racial discrimination, because of who she was, and her whole experience during World War II. Well, and then we have Ethan, who starts off, and through his journey, being a very closeted gay man, and facing that discrimination for, who he was, something that, and because of that kind of discrimination, people can take longer to kind of find their authentic selves and who they really should have been. And I don't want to, sound real new agey and all this, but I really think that, we're meant to kind of find our loves and what we like throughout life, and we can be thwarted in a lot of ways. And I think my mother certainly was thwarted. And there's this quote I carried around with me because I always want to make sure that I get it right. Trauma in a person, decontextualized over time, looks like personality. Trauma in a family, decontextualized over time, looks like family traits. Trauma in a people, decontextualized over time, looks like culture. That's from Resmaa Menakem, a psychotherapist and author. And my point is that even now, okay, I'm 64 and my mother passed away 10 years ago. So I knew her all my life. For 54 years, I knew this woman, and I cannot tell you for sure what was her personality. And I mean, what was the person that she would have been had this trauma not occurred to her. I can definitely point to parts of her personality that, yeah, this came from what happened to her in World War II. But you know, it's sad, really, that I don't know. And I knew her for 54 years. And I think a lot of, and similar to a lot of gay, the LGBTQ community, where people stay closeted for so long, they end up becoming someone that maybe they weren't supposed to be. And maybe they come out later and then they try to find that authentic self. So sorry, I'm rambling and all.
No.
Kimi, thank you for that question, and that's why the book was written the way I did.
Thank you.
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I have one comment. Speaking of trauma, that I want to. I just realized that because I love both your books, but all of our books deal with some pretty heavy trauma.
Mm-hmm.
But all of them, to me anyway, and maybe it's just the way because of the way I view the world or because of my background, I think all of the books ended on a rather hopeful note, and especially yours, Emily, because yours, here they are at the end, the Sakamoto family, so much uncertainty in the future. They're getting shipped off somewhere. They don't know where. They don't know what to expect and all that. But I don't know if you purposely wrote it, Emily, or maybe I'm misinterpreting. But I felt like this hopefulness to it. The sisters getting closer and understanding each other better. I love that part. And I think, and I'm really curious what you two think. It's because of, for me anyway, the way my mother, even after everything she went, she had this belief in the U.S. that it was a good country, and she tried to shield my brothers and me from, the worst of it, of what happened to her, the trauma she suffered during World War II, which is why I think I have a basically optimistic outlook on life, and I try to look at the brighter side. And part of it is the shikata ganai and the gaman, and Emily in your book, shikata ganai and the ... what is and what comes after, that's definitely the way I was raised. And so, for both of your books, even though they deal with some very substantial trauma, I thought had a very kind of uplifting ending. And that's how I felt. And just
I'm glad. Well, I'm glad because. So, sorry, say that again.
Do you want to start with that, Emily?
Oh, sure. No, I mean, I think I've talked with some of my cousins, and we have wondered how much of our grandparents' silence was trauma, how much of our grandparents' silence was trying to move on, and how much of our grandparents' silence was trying to protect us so we could have something better, and not be burdened by their story. And so I, obviously I knew when I was writing my book that it was going to end. They had to go to these prison camps. It would have been untrue to my family and the experiences they had to, somehow get them out of it. But in some way I wanted to write for my grandma, especially, some sort of triumph. It's a chance to process it and to think about what happened to my grandma, but also to be like, I want to give her these triumphs, at least fictionally, and so I wrote this, some of the first chapters in the months after my father died. And so I was working through that, but that also gave me the opportunity to have this family be broken from having lost a parent, and then have an arc in there that even though they were going to end up going to this prison camp, they could have an arc where there's some sort of triumph or some subplots where there's triumph, where, like coming out of these things a little more united as a family. That is the truth. I mean, when we talk about truth as we have been today, that is the true story for my family. They went into camp and learned from that terrible experience, and coming out of it to this place where there were no other Japanese for 100 miles, to hold together, to help each other, to, stay close. And as horrible as the things that happened are, that is the thing that I'm grateful for about the whole thing, is that it's kept our family, ties so close. And so that kind of came through in the story too. I think, just fictionally you weave that in. But I don't know. I think I believe in people, which is also part of why I write, because you're so often faced with things that sort of get in the way of that belief, and you have to weigh those things and process those things. But yeah, I want to hear from both of you too about how you find that hope.
Yeah, for me, it's interesting. The first earlier drops of Block 17 ended less hopefully. And I don't know. It's funny because I don't know if you all know the film Get Out by Jordan Peele. It's one of my favorite.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that he had a different ending, a much more tragic ending. And then the 2016 election was happening, and just so much was going on in our world that he really felt like he wanted hope. He wanted to give some sense of, like you said, Emily, triumph and hope. And so he changed the ending, and that affected me. And I did feel that, like you said, Emily, I believe in the human spirit. And in my story is also, Block 17 has a sort of a spiritual journey. I looked to the Jizo myth, the Jizo legend, or the god Jizo who protects children. And there's this river, the Sino Kawada, that you maybe have heard of, but in Japanese culture, the belief that when we die, there's this river that we cross, and sometimes we can get stuck in this sort of in-between state with Oni, with demons. And so in a way, I felt like the incarceration was this sort of Sino Kawada, and that river that I was, running through it was the Sino Kawada in a way. And that my main character now is sort of stuck in a Sino Kawada of sorts. But that she finds this sort of this connection with Jizo that was cut off before camp, because they had to sort of destroy everything before camp. And early on in the novel, the character witnesses her mother burning the Jizo statue because she couldn't bring it to camp. And this sort of sense of that protection being cut off. Jizo leads children especially, but vulnerable spirits across the Sino Kawada, and he wasn't there to protect them in camp. But then Jane, unconsciously, she sleepwalks, and my mom used to sleepwalk during camp, which I always thought was such a metaphor, because her mom would find her basically escaping out into the fresh air unconsciously. And so my main character, like I was saying, she's an unreliable narrator consciously, but unconsciously, she's got this spiritual connection to this ghost haunting her. And so it's more during her unconscious states of sleepwalking that she's able to find her healing. So I think my sense of hope in the novel was this sense of that we have this internal spirit in our relationship with the past that can't be broken.
Well,
I love that.
I love that, and I have to say, because it's quite possible the three of us could have ended up being very bitter people and angry. And, I don't get any of that sense from your writing. And I hope you didn't get it from mine, because I don't feel that way. So I think it's a testament to our parents and grandparents, and that somehow, even though we may have suffered from this intergenerational trauma, that, we didn't come out of it so damaged that, like you were saying, Emily, where maybe you don't trust people at all, or that, and I go back to the Nisei and Issei, everything kodomo no tame ni, for the children, so you endure, and you just stick it out, and hoping that for the next generation that it will, be better, and you're trying to pave the way for them. And I think for me, that's why I've remained optimistic. And I think it was very clear. And Emily, you talked about this a little earlier about, the life you have now, that it was because of sacrifices we made. And, you cannot compare my opportunities that I've had in my life compared to my parents, and compared to their, you can't even compare. It's just on a different plane, and and it's because of them. And I think we are grateful for that, and that our parents that protected us. And maybe for Kimi, for you and me, maybe we would have liked to have known more earlier, but we eventually found out. And I just I had to say that I was struck by that of all three of our books, and I feel this bond. And also I told you the other night, and the more I thought about it, the more I feel it's true. When I read your book, Kimi, I just felt like Jane Akiko, it was like the sister to my narrator, Ethan.
Yeah.
These, and then when I read your book, Emily, I was like, oh my gosh, it's Sam, but I think more the older sister. I felt like she's the mother of Timmy's, main character, and my main character. So you can definitely see the how the even though our novels are very different, and written differently and all that, I felt like this I'm not even sure what the right words are, but how interrelated they are, these stories. And and three of us, I mean, we grew up with very different backgrounds, and I grew up in Honolulu, and you, Emily, in Utah, and but yet our stories resonate in a way, and they kind of dovetail in just a nice way, which is why I think both of your books really resonated with me, and it's just a pleasure to read.
Oh, thank you so much. And I have to say, part of what's so important to me about Japanese Americans writing about this is I want my children to know, what we have survived, what we have to be grateful for, just all these stories. And we need lots of them, because then it's not just one narrative, one kind of simplified narrative, but it has individual experiences. And so I'm very grateful for your books, which I'm hoping all my kids in time will read. And,
and ironically, Emily, you're the one that captured, sort of the Nisei generation. Kimiko and I, who are older than you, we did the songs. You think maybe it'd be the other way around? Maybe there's good reasons why it turned out the way it did.
Yeah, speaking of our children learning, and I would definitely want my daughters to read your book, Emily. And eventually yours too. Well, my older one could definitely read it. Now she just went off to college, but it was really profound being there with them. They were two of the youngest pilgrims at the pilgrimage to Rower, and they just loved talking to the Nisei generation. There were a lot of survivors there. One man, I think he was like 100 and something. Maybe Kimiko can correct me later, but I think his name was George, and oh my gosh, he just had all these amazing stories. And talk about that humor. The humor that I use. I'm glancing in the chat questions here, but talking about like anger at what happened, and I definitely felt that growing up, just angry at what happened, and the humor and the cheerful stories would kind of bug me. I'd be like, why aren't they angry? But now looking back, now that I'm older, and I'm seeing that yes, there's some of that still for me, but on the other hand, that spirit, that tenacious spirit, like all my uncle's stories about camp were victory stories, like how he stole cigarettes. He snuck out in a hole in the fence and stole cigarettes, or pulled one over on the guards, and he and his buddies stole like a turkey from the mess hall and feasted by the river. And like I said, at first I thought, it's sad that he's repressing the hard stuff and he has to tell himself these cheerful stories. But no, now I'm looking back and I'm really seeing his like tenacious spirit and that healing power of humor. I think there obviously has to be a balance. And I think the later generations are really getting in touch with that outrage that I'm all for anger. I'm really into anger. I love the show Beef. That was like, just really, let's get into that anger. So I'm not at all, but I do think that I don't sort of have the same point of view about the humor and the optimism that the Nisei generation had. I really admire that now.
Yeah. Kimi, what you just said reminds me, I just watched a video with Dr. Satsuki Ina, if the name rings a bell, I consider her one of the leading experts on intergenerational traumas, especially as it pertains to Japanese American families. So she did this video not that long ago, and I watched it. And one of the audience members, who I think was a Buddhist priest, talked about how a lot of these older Nisei now, who are dying or at the final stages of their life, that for a lot of them, this anger comes out. Anger that they've bottled up, that protected us for all these years. And this priest was saying that it in a way, it part of it is unnerving and a little frightening, because some of these people, seem, very nice, that he's known for a while, seem, very, very, I can only think the Japanese word otonashi, very, very easygoing and very, and all of a sudden, at the end of their lives, this anger comes out, and it just makes you realize, oh yeah, they have bottled up a lot, and yeah.
Oh, Aaron.
Sorry this is such a beautiful conversation. I almost did not want it. I know this could go on. We'll have to have more. Thank you so much, the three of you, for sharing it. Just listening to you talk about writing and this process of sort of drawing from your family stories and using fiction as a sort of path towards truth was just really beautiful. We do have some questions from the audience that I'd like to make sure we chat about before we come to the end of our session. So maybe we'll start, and whoever wants to jump in, all three of you, or however we want to do it. A question from Ken Mochizuki. Hi, Ken. Thanks for being here. Who writes, studies have concluded that Yonsei are more outraged about the incarceration than Sansei. Were the Yonsei more fortunate in having more books and media about the subject that maybe the Sansei generation didn't have? So picking up sort of the threads of where we just were in some ways.
I think so, and I'm Sansei, but I feel kind of Yonsei because my mom was the baby of her family, and then she waited to have me until she was older, which back then was like 34. But I'm definitely like a lot younger than my cousins, and so when I meet a lot of Yonsei, I'm like, and I do think there's this sense of like, I went to UC Santa Cruz, and I learned about the incarceration and that switch from calling it camp to incarceration. And I think there is a lot more history coming out, and all the stuff that was suppressed for various reasons, survival, forcibly suppressed and silenced and taken out of the history books. It wasn't in the history books, and it was shame. Why can't, what happened to me isn't valid because it's not even included in the history books.
Well, as a Yonsei, I feel actually the opposite. I feel like I'm kind of an old Yonsei, but because my dad was born in camp, but I think, by the time I was in fourth grade, I remember there was one paragraph about incarceration in my fourth grade textbook, and my teacher skipped it. We didn't talk about it, but I did see it, and I do think there is privilege in that, and having it even acknowledged. And specifically now, if we look at, as we're at this point in our lives, people are talking about things that have been so, and there's room for lots of different trains of thought instead of like one kind of narrative that comes to us through our newspapers that we open on Sunday. We have, just an explosion of different venues where we can go to express thoughts and feelings, and so yeah, I do think we were fortunate to have that, and perhaps it probably cuts both ways. Mm-hmm. But I do think I'm grateful that it's a conversation that people are having, and I'm, as I go to these pilgrimages, I'm grateful for the way that the older generation is also starting to talk about it.
Yeah, I have to say I envy you, Emily, because you're so young, and you've known your knowledge, and here I am, I'm 64 this year, and I talk about putting together the puzzle pieces of my family. I don't even know what the puzzle is. I don't even know I'm still discovering this, and unfortunately for me, all the Nisei in my mother's family, not only my mother, but her siblings, they've all passed on. And geez, I wish I had just started this so much earlier, that, when they were still alive, and I could have put this puzzle together, much sooner. And I could kick myself at times, but then I tell myself, well, we get busy sometimes working, and you get, and that's my excuse. But I envy you. I love that the Yonsei that were more educated earlier, so that they could begin asking questions earlier and learning.
The last Heart Mountain, we did this like writers workshop, and I think there's a Tadaima writers workshop too, or something. It's something I've heard. And my one, I'm sure there's a lot of J's out there. And my thought is just, the best thing, it was painful, but I'm so grateful to my grandparents. I asked my grandparents when I was in college if I could interview them. And they kind of were not sure. And then my grandpa wrote me and said, this is really hard for me, but I'll do it because I love you. And those things that he told us are now, he's gone. He's been gone for a very long time. But we have these stories. And so if, without, of course, stepping over people's will, if they really can't talk about it. But if they are willing, that's like the best thing you can do, is just do those interviews while they're still around.
Yeah, I feel so lucky. Like I was saying, my mom is 87, lives downstairs. She'll be 87 in a month. And then my aunt, who's going to be 89 in a couple weeks, lives right close by. And then my aunt, who's 93, is in LA. And I'm texting them throughout my process. I'll be like writing, and then I'll text them, hey guys, and they're like constantly with me. I feel so blessed because they were there. It's amazing. And I just wanted to say one other little thing about, just in terms of like over time, I really feel that the reparations, even though you can't put a number on what was lost ever, but having that formal, acknowledgement, apology, as empty in some ways as that can be, but I felt like I saw a shift in my own family's attitude about being willing to talk about the dark side and the anger. A lot of the anger came out once it was publicly acknowledged with those reparations. I think there's something really profound. And I think our country has a lot more reparations to give out and publicly acknowledge and apologize and put money on. Our country is all about, for better or worse, money. So putting money shows a certain commitment, on something.
Yeah, I want to thank the three of you so much. I mean, especially for those comments. I think there's a real generosity that shines through from each of you today in your work and in just how you talk about your families and this process. And for me, it's been a really helpful reminder of, Alden, it's never too late to start asking these questions. And it's a constant process of as someone who's also, still trying to ask these questions of folks who are no longer around to answer them. It's okay. Like, I think the asking of the questions is such an important part of the process, whether there are answers to be found, as I think all of you have talked about today with this sort of turn to fiction. Like, that is such an important part of how we think about and learn about history. So, I'm sorry, folks watching along. I know we did not get to all of the audience questions, but I think we touched on them in different moments. And I want to just, in our final minute, if there's anything any of you would like to say in closing, to just sort of give you this last moment.
Just thank you so much, Erin and Kimiko, Mar, and everyone at Tadaima, and, for organizing all of this. I feel really honored to be part of it. And thank you, Alden and Emily, for your amazing work.
Yeah, we're lucky to have more books now too, but we're also lucky to have a stronger Japanese American community that is trying to do these kind of things. And so, thank you.
And thank you for people turning in, listening. And,
yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you, Kimiko, Alden, and Emily for this. Thank you, Kimiko Mar and Caroline Kimura backstage. And folks, please keep tuning in, and thank you for being here, and happy rest of Tadaima. Happy rest of the weekend. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks, everyone.